Harry, thank you very much for spending the time today.
No problem, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
I always start with my introductory questionnaire. What is your favorite word?
So, this is a difficult question to ask a writer. I always used to say in training sessions, because I'd ask what your favorite word is, that it was chunk. But then I did a training session once and someone went, "Oh, yeah, like chunks of dog food." And so I got totally put off that word. So I usually say mellifluous,
Nice,
which is like really lovely melodic sounding. And I've stuck with that for about 10 years, so I don't have to think about it.
nice. What is your favorite swear word?
I think fuck as a kind of an an adjective and a noun and a very versatile swear word is probably top of the list. Also, you've let me know that we can swear on the podcast, which is great because I wasn't sure.
What excites you creatively or intellectually?
Um, a nice, juicy, open problem with a few constraints in it, but not too many. I don't like it when there's too open a brief or too closed one.
What doesn't excite you?
Spreadsheets.
What's a piece of advice you like to give?
Uh, you can never ask too many questions, and that's particularly true of writers. I think the job is to ask an inordinate amount of questions.
What's the best piece of advice you've received?
I can't use the same one again, can I? Um, to always try and trust a balance of data and your own judgment and never lean too much into one or the other.
Is there a book that's changed your life?
Yeah, I read Sophie's World when I was a teenager, which is basically kind of an intro to philosophy, but also kind of a novel, kind of a meta novel about philosophy. And it made me want to study philosophy at uni, which I did along with history. So in that sense, yeah, because it changed my kind of academic career.
Is there a book you haven't read yet but wish you had already?
Ulysses, I've tried. There's a new George Saunders book which isn't out yet, so I couldn't, I guess, legally have read it. But he's my favorite author, so I'm very excited for
Uh, I really, I can't decide what kind of length of a writer I am.
that.
Sometimes I feel like I should commit to a novel. Other times I feel like I should do short stories. Or I might feel, am I a weekly writer? Am I a monthly writer? Should I commit to writing a non-fiction book? And when I was in a short story phase, I read George Saunders' book about sort of Chekhov and Tolstoy in short stories.
Yeah, he's an incredible. I mean, he's a real bastard because he did probably some of the world's best short stories and then wrote what I believe is an absolutely incredible novel. His first novel, Lincoln in the Bardo. So the problem with thinking about doing writing and looking around at who has already done it is that everyone's already done it better than you ever will, so you never start. But to that question of like what kind of thing, I would go, what am I trying to say, and then work out what the format is.
Finally, are there any fictional characters you like to imagine yourself being?
Imagine myself being Uh, no, because most of the books that are good, the characters go through some really terrible experiences. That's what makes them good, right? So no, but I did have, uh, as a teenager, incredible admiration and probably pretty strong crush on Lyra Balakwa from the Northern Lights trilogy.
So, like me, you studied history, and two things occurred to me preparing for this talk. First one was that most of my history teachers taught me how to write well. Particular shout out to Mrs. Mackley, who taught the value of signpost sentences at the start of paragraphs and concluding ones at the end. And secondly, when I try to imagine examples of good writing, my mind immediately goes to history books I've read rather than, say, novels. So I'm sort of curious about your relationship with history and good writing.
Yeah, I think that is very fair that what you learn in history more than anything else is how to construct and deconstruct an argument, right? If you study history beyond like A level, it's historiography, it's how did they get here and why and what are their biases. You're really doing kind of a pulling apart of the source material, and that is just learning how to be a writer. I did history and philosophy at uni. English was always my best subject, but I didn't want to have my, in some pompous way as a teenager, I didn't want to have my reading diet dictated to me, which I'm glad I did because I know people who did English and kind of hate, I don't know, Dostoevsky because they had to absorb it rather than coming to it on their own.
There's
Um,
there's a Orwell essay that's always stuck in my mind about how when he worked in a bookstore, he grew to hate books. And
yeah,
so I've always had that kind of like, don't study or work on the thing that you actually like.
yeah. Kurt Vonnegut, who's another one of my favorite writers, always says the best writers you'll find them in the physics department, or you'll find them in anthropology. Like, don't go to English because they're all learning. It's under the hood. It's being a mechanic rather than a race car driver. I don't know if that's fair, but that was kind of my approach to it as well. But yeah, history. I mean, the things that I enjoyed were things where I was predominantly writing, and I had an affinity for that. You know, pulling it apart and putting the argument together, and kind of much preferred it if you could waffle and not have to have a definitively right or wrong answer. And that's stayed true to this day.
You were in charge of writing at Monzo for nearly 7 years and consulted on writing for companies before that. And I thought if you give an overview of your career.
Yeah, so like I said, I didn't kind of choose an English career. I was good at writing at school. I did a master's degree in history because I liked it. And then I thought, you know, the world is my oyster. I'm a master of history. And then I graduated in the uh, crash of like 2008-9, and no one cared. So I got a job as a proofreader because I could spell. And then I kind of sideways moved my way into being editor for an agency called The Writer, which I saw an ad saying that we exist to rid the world of the tyranny of linguistic mediocrity. And I had no idea what that meant, but it sounded really good. So I got a job there and learned how to be a writer in the kind of copywriting brand consultancy sense. Ran training sessions on writing, built writing programs where you try and decide what is our brand, what is our, you know, the industry vernacular is tone of voice, and how do we change this customer experience through the words we use, and did that for years. Got a bit bored of being given presenting problems rather than underlying problems to solve, which is what happens when you work in an agency. You don't ever really get under the hood of what's going on because it's in another budget center, or it's somebody else's problem, or they don't have the money, or whatever it might be. So I wanted to go in house and try and do all the things that we've been saying would work for the last 6 years when I was the writer. What if we actually just did all of that all at the same time? Would it actually really work? And that's what I tried to do at Monzo. They weren't hiring for writers, so I pitched my job to them. I wrote them an email saying, look, you really care about writing, but as far as I can tell, no one owns it. I could do that for you. Here's what I would do. And they listened. This is in the glorious kind of golden age of lots of money floating around in startups. And they gave me paid freelancing work as my interview, which is crazy and unsustainable. And then I just went in there as the first writer and created the Monzo tone of voice and built out the writing team and the processes, and was there for about 6.5 years, yeah. And then left and did a little bit of consulting while I figured out what the next move would be. And now I am the head of writing and customer experience at Sunsave, which is a clean energy tech solar company where I do the same thing for a double industry rather than a single one, because we have energy regulation and finance. I've been there for about 6 months.
I guess Monzo is sort of noteworthy in, I guess, placing an emphasis on writing as opposed to derogatory content. And I'm curious about why that was.
Yeah, I mean, when you are a bank that lives on a phone, we have no call centers really. You could phone us, but it wasn't the first thing. You like live chat was always our thing. We had no branches. The words are the customer experience. The words are the brand. You don't really interact with us in any other way apart from words and numbers on a screen. And so if you care about making that a good experience, you have to care about the words that you use. And Monzo already cared about that in kind of the proto state. When I joined, the company was around 150 people. So it wasn't teeny tiny, but it wasn't anywhere. You know, I think they're somewhere around 4,500 people now. So I went in and said, look, if we want this kind of really good customer centric culture that we have to be real in the product, then we have to care about every word in the product. And that goes for T's and C's, landing pages, emails, error messages, all that kind of stuff. And they were very receptive. And so I was always pushing against an open door to make that happen, which is, I think, what made it such a great place to work for me anyway.
My experience as being in charge of writing are with small teams or small organizations. How do you do that at scale?
Yeah. I mean, it's just harder, obviously, at scale. especially when the thing that you care about most is consistency. Like the thing that I always cared about more than anything else is that it should be what you get from Monzo in terms of how we communicate with you should feel the same everywhere all the time. So you don't have this big discrepancy between what the marketing sounds like and what the T's and C's sounds like, which is what most companies have. And when that happens, people look at it and go, okay, you're just trying to sell me something with the marketing, but the T's and C's, that's who you really are. And that's why we don't trust you. So I really wanted to break that kind of that common structure that happens. But that means that you have to be in with the guys in legal, and you have to be in with all the people in risk, and you have to be on board with everybody, every part of the business, and that's just really hard at scale. So part of it was hiring a team and then putting them in the business. So we didn't have a centralized writing function. We didn't have a split between kind of what you normally get, which is copywriting, and then something that might be called content design or UX writing. And one half works in marketing and brand, and the other half maybe works over in product, and they basically never talk to each other. That to me is absolute lunacy, because writing is writing, and the words that the customer sees are all part of the same experience. So we would hire people who were capable of working fairly autonomously and making the case for good writing on their own and building rapport, and then put them in parts of the business, and they would be responsible for writing in that part of the business. And we would come together and do stuff together, and then they would go off and work on their own stuff individually. And as we grew, we tried to maintain a reasonable ratio of the number of writers to the amount of stuff that was going on, which we never managed because the company grew way faster than we ever could. But that idea of having people around the business who were partners for those areas meant that we could stay closer to risk, legal, compliance, product, all the other parts of the business that traditionally writers don't really get as close to. And then I spent most of my time trying to do the strategy bit above of convincing people that writing mattered and reminding them how closely it was tied to our values. And if you say you care about transparency, but then people can't understand your words, then you're objectively not transparent. So this is part of who we are as a business, and proving the value of what we were doing by measuring it. If we change these words, what is the direct metric impact, and bringing that to the people who needed numbers to be convinced. And just trying to create overall a culture where people cared about writing and understood the value of it. And I think that worked, and that's the legacy bit that I'm most proud of, is that team being there who are set up to do good stuff and have more access than most writing teams I think ever do. And also an environment where you don't need writers for people to care about writing. Everybody there cares about writing. The writers are there just to kind of elevate the execution of that rather than try and make the case for it day to day.
Yeah, really interesting idea of like how does a large organization or an institution have a consistent voice? Years ago, I was in charge of comms for an MP, and I had a running battle with the chief of staff over the MP's voice, like his external communications to constituents. And it was it was almost like a philosophical battle over what should an MP be, and what should they do, and what should the relationship be with his constituents. So I would write press releases, articles in his name, and my style is very much why use two words when one would do, and simplify, clarify, because the point of the MP is to convey what he believes, convey what he's doing to his constituents in a way that garners support from them in the next election. The chief of staff was more why use one word when two could do. His style was more formal, technocratic, and almost, I felt, in a way to impress constituents with the MP's erudition. And so between the two of us, it was a constant tussle of like, what should be the voice of the MP? And so I'm curious about how do you get the one voice in a large organization?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think they are two different questions, actually, because in in your case, it's funny that neither of you were asking what the MP's actual voice was,
Which is
because that's
a whole other problem.
yeah, like the two of you were arguing about which version, your two versions of the truth it should be, and whoever the MP was kind of irrelevant. Um, the voice that the MP used should be the voice of the MP, because they should go on TV and sound like they do in their dispatches, and they should, it should feel authentic to them. And maybe they need some training to sound better on TV, but I think authenticity only comes from repeatedly doing the same things at different times, in different circumstances, in stress situations, in joyful celebrations. If it feels wildly different in different situations, then people are going to be not really thinking that person is being honest, intellectually honest, emotionally honest. Um, if their own natural style is to waffle on and never get to the point, then obviously you want to train that out of them and write more clearly. I'm definitely in this kind of battle of erudition versus clarity. Like, clarity wins, and there is an absolute ton of research that proves that the more overcomplicated you make language, the less people actually think it's a sign of intelligence. The opposite is true. I could cite sources if you want, but people can go and look after it for themselves. There's an amazing study called by a guy called Daniel M. Oppenheimer, who, as far as I know, it's no relation. It's called "The Consequences of Erudite Vernacular Utilized Irrespective of Necessity, or the Problems with Using Long Words Needlessly." And it's basically a big study that proves that the more complicated you make language, the less people think that is a marker of intelligence and trustworthiness. So you were right, and the chief of staff was wrong. But equally, if what you did sounded nothing like what the MP does when he spoke, then that's not great either. There has to be some middle ground. In a big organization, the problem you're facing is that there are, in some cases, literally thousands of people writing every day directly to customers, especially if you've got like frontline customer service. If you're a service business like a bank or an insurance firm or telecoms or whatever, energy, you cannot impose a writing style or a tone of voice that is really idiosyncratic and has little linguistic flourishes and all that stuff, because 5,000 people can't do that. They're not being hired for that skill. It's not fair to expect them to be able to do that. So if you look at the Monzo tone of voice guidelines as I first created them back in 2018, the advice in there was good writing 101. Write about what readers care about, put it in the order they care about it in, use language that they use, get to the point, don't overcomplicate. It was really just kind of like basic good writing stuff. The thing that we did that was, I think, the difference maker is that we really applied it everywhere all the time, and we trained every single person in the business to use it, and we kept banging on about it in all of our all hands meetings. And I got buy-in from the exco all the way from the CEO down, because Tom Blomfield, who was the CEO at the time, understood this and cared about it, and himself was a good communicator. So it was easy for me to kind of get that support. The trick is just repetition, really repetition, and making it so that the advice that you're giving is practical, applicable advice. We didn't have a set of tone of voice principles that said we're human and we're friendly and we said, when you are writing, do not use the passive voice. By the way, here's what the passive voice is and here's how to avoid it. And practically in your own writing, here is exactly what you do day to day. So people recognize that this was something that was relevant to their jobs and also was going to help them in their jobs. Because if you work on a desktop or you work on a laptop, congratulations, you're a writer. That is your main job every day, is to put words on pages that other people read. So if you can help people be better at that, and that helps them in their own job, they're much more likely to get on board with it than if you come in with some abstract idea of this is the brand message that most people don't care about or understand how it relates to them. So it's about making writing an applicable, relevant thing to everybody's role, and then giving people principles which they can apply and aren't going to flummox them in a difficult moment and aren't going to be really, really hard to apply in a stress situation versus a marketing opportunity versus internal comms. And that is a never-ending difficult thing to do. I think we did it fairly well at Monzo. I think we've done it fairly well at Sunsave so far. A lot smaller Sunsave, but the same principles apply there too.
Another experience I had was being in charge of comms at a human rights NGO, like a legal NGO.
Mm.
And I was constantly I was constantly struggling with lawyers who wrote like lawyers. I launched a newsletter that would have weekly articles about some legal issue. And this NGO was doing so much good work on human rights, European rights, doing cases at like the European Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Justice, and they would send me the articles, and it would read like a um, academic journal. It would read like a legal brief in brackets, a case citing, and in the end, I had to write style guides for writing articles, posting on Instagram, posting on Twitter, just to try and anytime I saw any legal citations, I just like crossed them out,
Hmm.
which I think would really annoy them. But it was like no one really cares if it's Smith versus Hatfield.
Yeah, yeah. So many people's careers are writing and they don't quite realize that's what that is. Like lawyers are professional writers, that's what they do. And you spent your entire career learning from a certain school of writing and doing writing for a certain purpose. That purpose isn't really the elucidation of the reader. The purpose is to win and to be watertight, or to win by being vague enough that you could argue about it in court in the future, which a lot of legal writing is. Like it's not actually more precise; it's more deliberately vague. And somewhere between those two things is the clarity is kind of the third thing that's important and not nearly so much. So there's a cultural thing about your writing style is so bound up in your profession that if somebody comes in and says, well, actually, I think this writing could be different, what they're saying is you're terrible at your job, or your entire professional career is a sham, or you've been wrong your whole life, which is why writing training sessions are always part therapy and part practical. Um, but also the purpose of the writing. Who is that writing for? The writing's for the reader. Who is the reader? If the reader is another lawyer, you obviously have a different set of rules and rubrics that you can use. But if the reader is 500 people who might be looking at this on their phone who don't really care, you should adjust your approach accordingly for them. Writing is for the reader, not for you. And the number one sin of writing and business writing in particular is not really writing for the reader. Like so many companies write for themselves. They don't intend to, but they're just so bound up in their own sign-off processes or prejudices or which manager might be reading this or whatever it is that they forget to really focus on who the end audience is. And yeah, like quoting citations from case law. Who is that for? Is that for the reader? No, it's not for the reader. It's just a habit that the writer has because that's what they've done their whole career. And that feels like the natural thing to do when you start writing.
I mean, that kind of links back to what we were saying about the MP in the I've sort of long had this belief that like when people assume a certain role or say it's an MP or a CEO or something like that, they have an idea of how they ought to act that is separate from maybe how they feel they do act. So, and I think this is true of say Keir Starmer as well. Of like the guy I work for, and I say Keir Starmer as well. There's an idea of how they ought to communicate, which is you see it in press releases and in statements where like they're never angry or sad or happy. They're only ever pleased or displeased by things. Like this, they're pleased to have won £1 billion. They're displeased that they've lost a lottery ticket. They really restrict the emotional range to something that's artificial. Usually because it's the cues they've gotten from others. And I also found this working at startups for a CEO as well, where like what other companies were doing would be copy and pasted because it was seen to be the correct thing to do, as opposed to was it actually a good idea?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like the history of the formality of business writing is it's a habit, it's a tradition. It's not more effective. People don't like it more. In fact, the opposite is true. That's a big part of what that Oppenheimer research shows. But we have this idea that formal and serious are the same thing. And that idea is so closely tied together in our own minds that we don't even realize that those are just two ideas that we've bundled together. Like the formality of the language that a business uses or the government uses or, whatever it might be, the formality ratchets up when the topic gets more serious. Like if you're in debt, the debt chasing message will be considerably more formal in tone than the marketing message. That's just because that's a habit that we've associated in our mind. That's the language of authority. And that goes directly back to like the roots of English. Like the Romans came a couple of thousand years ago and brought Latin with them. Latin became the language of religion administration. That's why the words religion and administration come from Latin. Like Latin stuck around after the Romans left. And it was a social hierarchical tool that people in charge spoke in Latin and wrote in Latin, and plebs couldn't understand it. And that was compounded when the Normans invaded and they brought French. And English for, I don't know, 1500, 1700 years was just for plebs. It was never written down. It wasn't formalized. It wasn't serious. And so the language that we associate is the language of authority, things which are important and written down, legal texts, religious texts. They were done in Latin, and then later in English that comes from Latin. Latin is the language of classical education. It's the language of law. Like the Roman legal tradition is the Western legal tradition still to this day, mostly. So what we think of as serious authoritative language is the parts of English that come from Latin. The words like require and necessitate and provide and all that kind of language of business. And the language that we use when we talk to each other, which largely comes from Anglo-Saxon, spoken English, is seen as, if you write it down, well, that's not formal enough. This is the split probably between you and your chief of staff. Like, you know, everyday English versus that kind of Latinate formal prose.
I
But
mean,
when
in my exit interview, I did say to him, pompous isn't the same thing as professional.
yeah, but you couldn't, I mean, that is very, very difficult message for many people to hear because pompous and professional are so closely related that people can't even see that they're separate. And when you assume that language, you put on that formal language, you are putting on the armor of authority. And so when you're a lawyer going into battle with another lawyer, you both put on your armor of formal English. And when you are a business trying to chase somebody for debt, you put on that armor of authority, and it creates a hierarchy where you are above the other person you are speaking down to them. And I think if you're a government official, you want to some level to have the bit of higher ground, not too far because you don't want to be disconnected from the people, but you're certainly not one of the people. And so you're in this awkward middle ground where partly the language you use has to follow this tradition of kind of business sounding Latinate language. And partly, I think, separate but related, the idea of not being able to show too much emotion, I feel like it's quite outdated as well. People want, you know, authentic politicians to actually be who they are. You see the difference between how Mamdani positions himself or AOC in the States versus what some of our elected officials are like and how kind of dry and taciturn they seem in comparison. I think they are just hanging on to a tradition that is expected without really ever interrogating why, in the same way that businesses use formal professional English as just the standard without ever really interrogating why and if it's effective and where that bias comes from in the first place.
I mean, that's like a nice segue to what I want to turn to next, which is there's been a lot of talk recently about a literacy crisis. Like,
Mm.
fewer and fewer people are reading things, especially for pleasure. More and more are consuming videos on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. There's an interesting like contrast is like you have people like Mamdani, um, even Nigel Farage, or Zara Sultana here, who have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of TikTok followers, where the message is like cut into a 30, 60 second direct to camera video versus someone like Stormer, who, in moments of crisis, usually puts out a written statement,
Mm.
and not really many videos. Whereas a particular directive video at a particular time, like say the anti-migrant protest, might have had a bigger political impact than a press release. And I think the writer Derek Thompson recently said that like everything's becoming television. There are a bunch of things in that I want to touch on, but like firstly, what is the value of written text as something in itself rather than it being the foundation or the script for television?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you talk about like reading for pleasure is down. That is true, but global literacy is also up, consistently trending up. We read more than we've ever read before. We just don't sit down and read Tolstoy in the same way that we used to. Like people are playing lit RPG games with 10 million lines of dialogue in them and sinking 150 hours into it. That's still reading. It's just a different form of reading. So it's not, I don't think there's a literacy crisis because literacy is actually higher than it's ever been. But there's definitely a, what is it that we're choosing to consume, or not even choosing, kind of unconsciously being pushed to consume? That is definitely shifting. I think what writing does, I'm not an expert in like the neuropsychology of it, but definitely if you sit and read and consume a thing, it affects your brain differently than if you passively hear it. You choose to sit and read a page or two, you are engaging a different part of your brain. Um, Generally speaking, if someone's written something down, that means you have a bit more time and space to unpack the thinking. Like everything cut for a 30-second clip is designed for engagement. It's clearly not designed for like a depth of understanding on this topic. It's designed to hit a single point or two or push a certain button, whether that's rage or joy or whichever metric you're trying to optimize for. And so the value of written text in that sense is like depth of engagement with an idea. I think that doesn't mean that a good speech recorded for TV or radio or whatever, or a podcast, for example, can't be obviously an in-depth investigation into a topic. But if you are the person writing and you're not using any outside help to write, you have to engage with your own thought process and clarify your ideas as you write them down. And then if you're somebody coming on to read that, you're engaging with hopefully a more kind of well-rounded, deeper interrogation of a topic, which is good because there are very few, simple solutions or simple explanations for why things are happening in the world. And so I think more in depth, I'm not sure about this, it could be that. Let's look at all the sources and factors, is something that we need rather than less.
I mean, doing this podcast has been like a real learning curve for me because I primarily think of myself as a writer, and uh, I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker. And I'm able to, there's that phrase about to write is to think. And so when I'm writing, I will develop ideas. I will go more in depth into things, everything like that. So when I started this podcast, I would end up writing scripts as pieces of writing, and questions would be quite long paragraphs. I have this. It's one of my OECD things of like I partly got it from Martin Amis of like I can't begin two consecutive sentences with the same letter. They have to be a different letter. Martin Amis's is two consecutive paragraphs, not the same letter. Mine's consecutive sentences. So I would write questions like that, and it just didn't translate well as audio. So over time, I've had to learn to like do rough outlines of a structure rather than sort of, especially when a guest goes off the script, and I'd sort of desperately try and bring them back to the beautiful piece of writing I've done. Um, and I guess it's that struggle of like the different mediums.
Yeah. Yeah, they're for different purposes. Exactly. Like what if you're writing something, it's designed to be kind of consumed as it is. If you're writing something as the basis for a conversation and then someone goes off on a tangent, which people do, they're not in your head, they're not following your train of thought the way that you do, you're stuck as a result. Yeah, I used to like write more extensive notes and have like pat answers in my mind for certain questions, and I still do to some extent, like rattling off the Oppenheimer research, because I've done it in literally 1,500 training sessions, so I know it. But it's not quite as tight down, and if we go off piste, I'm not gonna lose my grip too much, I hope. But when you write something down, you are forcing yourself to interrogate it as you write, and then hopefully constructing an argument. This is back to the history stuff again. Constructing an argument in such a way that the person at the other end goes, I see where you're coming from. Maybe my mind is slightly changed, or at least I'm interested to explore this idea a bit more.
Another Orwell essay I really like, and you probably read it. It's Politics in the English Language.
Hmm.
Um, and Orwell basically says that not enough people think about the words that they use. Um, like cliches will be used as like a substitute for thinking, and I don't know if it's bound up with the sort of rise of TikTok videos and stuff, but I kind of feel like a lot of people, especially politicians, have become less intentional with their words. When Boris Johnson wrote his uh, op-ed about burkas being letterboxes, um, the actual article itself was arguing against a burqa ban. However, those phrases seem to be thrown in for effect. And the reaction of, say, many people on the right was like, he's like catching attention, and it's pure. It has a purely theatrical purpose. However, there was a rise afterwards in anti-Muslim offences after that weekend of people shouting letterbox at Muslim women, stuff like that. And there was a particular clip where like Jacob Rees-Mogg said, oh, politicians shouldn't be boring, and it was words were purely for theatrical purpose to entertain, not to have like a real world purpose. And something similar happened with Keir Starmer's recent speech about Island of Strangers. Like the speech was targeted at like a small number of lobby journalists to produce an immediate effect on the whole media narrative about Labour versus reform and everything like that. Yet when speech went down badly, his aides insisted that the words were being misunderstood. He didn't really mean what he said. And then in an interview, Starmer basically said, "Oh, I didn't really think about the speech that much, and I just read it out, and I don't actually believe it anymore." Um, so I feel like there's the struggle of like, how do you make people appreciate the words that they use and having a real world effect?
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about a lot of that stuff. We're talking about framing, and framing is absolutely crucial. Like words have more of an impact than we realize. There's an amazing study by a woman I admire very much, Dr. Lera Boroditsky. She did this experiment a few years ago. Two groups of people. One of them, she says, you're the crisis management team of this fictional place called Addison. You have a problem. Your problem is that crime is spreading like a virus through the town. Go away and come up with solutions. She gives them a load of demographic data, information, numbers. The other group, they don't know there's two separate groups. The other group, she says, you're the crisis management team of this fictional town of Addison. You have a problem. Your problem, crime is rampaging like a beast through your town. Go away, come up with solutions. She gives them demographic data, numbers, information. Same data, same numbers, same information for both groups, completely identical. Groups go away, they come back a few days later. The group that she said crime is spreading like a virus come up with ideas like strengthen the social safety net, increase provisioning, more education. They want to inoculate the town. And the group that she said crime is rampaging like a beast, bigger guns, tougher policing, longer sentences. They want to fight because there's a beast and you fight the beast. And she reran the experiment a bunch of different times, different demographics, different political leanings, age, gender identity. It didn't make any difference. The thing that made the difference to how people responded was that tiny bit of language. Whether she'd characterized crime as a virus that was spreading or a beast that was rampaging had, I think it was a 2-to-1 impact on the types of solutions that people came up with. And the people had no idea this was happening. When she was like, why are you making these decisions? They were like, well, we're looking at the rational data and the numbers. And no, we are heavily, heavily influenced by language. And if people are being intentional about it, then you can use it for evil. And if people are not being intentional about it, it's happening anyway. Your intention as the writer is not the important thing. How it's characterized by the reader is the important thing. And if you are a senior politician, you should definitely be careful about the language used, especially when it comes to particular words and phrases, because they're going to get clipped up. Obviously, hungry editors are looking for the word that's going to go in the headline, and they're going to mischaracterize it deliberately because that gets engagement. Like, you're just foolish if you're not paying close enough attention to that. You probably heard the study before about, it's obviously a counterfactual, who knows, but what if it had been leave versus stay rather than leave versus remain? Because remain is a kind of a cold clinical word that we don't really use. It's unusual phrasing, whereas stay, you could have AD 17 up and down the country. Like, it's like that. Would that have been a 2% swing? Who knows? But it's a big decision. You sit there in the ballot box, you've got two options. We are influenced by language in ways that we don't really realize. That's not just in English as well. There's a great thing again, which I think I've stolen again from Lera Boroditsky. In German, the word for bridge is feminine, and in Spanish, it's masculine. I think I've got that the right way around. And if you ask Germans to describe just a bridge, they will use feminine words. They will say it's elegant, it's beautiful, it's whatever. And if you ask Spanish people, they will say it's towering, it's strong, it's phallic, because that masculine feminine identity is seeped into their unconscious appreciation of these totally genderless inanimate objects. Like, we are much more influenced by language than we realize. And I think certainly more public figures would do better if they realize that. And I think someone like Donald Trump has an innate understanding of this. He doesn't know the psychology, but he gets what buttons he can push with certain words and what will cut through. And someone like Keir Starmer seemingly does not.
What you just said about bridges. One of those books that I haven't yet read, but wish I had, is Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is all about blowing up a bridge, during the Spanish Civil War. So the fact that Hemingway talking about a very masculine bridge kind of makes sense. Everything you just said, it touches on something else I wanted to bring up, which is problem with this discussion is that it's the conflation of writing, words, and stories. And something I'm really interested in is this idea of like cliches, metaphors, allegories, stories influencing how companies or organizations deal with problems. Roy Stewart was talking about crisis management by cliche. The example he was using was when he was a deputy governor in Iraq, and his compound was surrounded by insurgents who were planning to attack. Initially, Stewart was saying he had in his mind General Gordon's last stand at Khartoum. And he was going into the crisis as like, I am General Gordon and I will fight to the last man. And then he said he kind of stopped himself because he was like, no, I'm not General Gordon. There are ways to de-escalate and negotiate my way out of this situation. There are women and children in the compounds that I can negotiate to get out and everything like that. And I've found that, and again, to bring it back to history, I'm guilty of what a friend called Aaronisms, which is some situation, some like crisis in startup I was working at, something like that. I'd sort of be like, this is like when Cardinal Richelieu, which can both provide clarity if you know the history, but also like limit your choices in dealing with a crisis.
Yeah, completely. I mean, now we're straying into like psychology stuff that I don't really feel expert to talk about, but from what I understand, like, we construct our identity through a series of stories that we tell ourselves. How much of a bearing on reality these stories have is, who knows, some more than others. But definitely if you have a set of kind of like comparisons that you reach for in certain situations, they are going to in some ways limit your potential understanding. And also, it's framing. The language is framing. Like in business, you have frontline customer service as if on the other side is the enemy. What does that do for how you treat those people? If there's a crisis, you have a war room in a business where you're supposed to be customer centric, and you've got a big heart-shaped brand somewhere. Like someone I used to work with understood that really well and actually reframed it so that they talked about their customer service team as being center stage. And I think that's a really nice reframing of the relationship that the customer service team has with the business and also has with the customers. You're performing for an audience and they are paying for it. And so you have to do something for them. And also you're at the center of this thing, not on the periphery of it over there next to the trenches. Like, that kind of thing makes a big difference. You have to be conscious of what those stories you're telling yourself are to be able to reframe them. But I think one of the ways to do it is to interrogate the language that you use. Like, why do we call this a war room? Like, I was in a meeting with a client, I can't remember when, however many years ago, it was a long time ago now, I think a finance client. And they were like, we're going to have a big strategic campaign over the next few months. We're going to launch a load of stuff at the same time. We're going to call it Operation Rolling Thunder. And there was a Vietnamese guy in the room. And I had to put my hand up and say, I'm not sure about Rolling Thunder. Like, I'm not sure if you. I know it's a common understanding. We know this idea of like rapid release of stuff all at the same time. But actually, where that comes from is it's the name of this thing that killed many thousands of civilians in the Vietnam War. And maybe we should rethink that. And he just hadn't thought about it. He just had been surrounded by this language of kind of like brutality of business, war rooms and fighting and frontline and all that kind of stuff. And that obviously has an impact on your psyche. Maybe it's, there's a chicken and egg thing there, right? Is that reflective of your actual opinion, or is that contributing to your opinion? Very hard to unpick, but certainly unconsciously using language or reaching for certain references and metaphors is going to influence your decision making in ways that you don't realize. And that's exactly what happened to those people in the fictional town of Addison's crisis management team.
In my old job, that whenever a particular crisis was happening, the CEO often would avoid updating investors on a crisis by saying we have to put the life masks on ourselves first, which then dictated choices, decisions, consequences, a triaging of things. And it's the metaphor had like knock-on effects down the line. Whereas if there hadn't been the metaphor, and so like instead of presenting the investors with a solution at the end, we hoped the investors could have been brought in at the beginning to fashion a better solution going forward. But it was always that image and that cliche of put the life mask on ourselves first. We became like imprisoned by it.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, and you're positioning yourselves as, first of all, everyone's going to die. That's your starting situation, which says a lot about like the mentality. And then you're like, okay, and if we're all going to die, who's more important? Who can we try and save? We can't save everyone. That's what triaging means. Triaging is there because some of them you're going to lose. So even that language of triage, which is so common in business as well, we've got a list of problems. Let's triage them. Some of them are going to burst into flames. That language as well. Burning platform is the old classic one from was it Nokia in the 90s, saying they had a burning platform and they had to dive into the sea. Very effective at rallying people, but also calm down. It was a mobile company. No, none of you were actually on fire. So there's a struggle between like evocative language that breaks through and also what priming is that doing to people's perception of what's going on. And again, you just have to be conscious of the decisions you're making. And like narrative and storytelling has become a beautiful naff catch-all, I think, these days. Like, it was great when I was at the writer, we used to sell storytelling training all the time, and it was really interesting and good and people enjoyed it. But it was just because everybody understood they had to have a story to tell. And I think that's really coming from the fact that there is a lot going on. You have all these different teams trying to do, you've got a strategy team, you've got go-to-market stuff going on, you've got sales, internal comms, you've got a brand team, social media trends, so many different threads. Whereas if you can have one slide that you present to the C-suite that says, here's the story, here's the narrative, it's nice and clean. And if it has no relation to the reality of what the customer experience is day to day, that doesn't really matter because it's a clear thing you can all line up behind. And people are searching for, a thing to grab onto. And narrative or storytelling is such a beautiful, vague term that it allows you to be talking about 6 or 7 different things, or not really quite talking about anything in that nice, vague way. And people are looking for that kind of structure when everything feels a little bit too confusing to grab a hold.
Finally, to sort of draw all this together, I was going to end on AI. Because as I said, I'm a big believer in like to write is the think. Why use 2 words when one would do? And I'm very uncomfortable with AI as a aid for writing. Firstly, because I think if you outsource a first draft to it, you don't think, you don't generate the ideas yourselves. Um, and then secondly, AI is a real tryhard when it comes to writing. Like it likes to show off, uh, and its writing isn't simple and clear. It likes using the big words.
Yeah.
So they're all my concerns. However, you did a survey on LinkedIn recently about
Yeah.
asking writers their attitude towards AI writing tools.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, it was a survey about, it was less about the attitude, it was more about how are you actually using it. And I can't remember the exact number, but basically the vast majority were, it was something like 120 people replied. So it's not a huge sample size, but it's not nothing. The vast majority of people were using AI writing tools of some kind. It was largely LLMs like ChatGPT or Claude, and they were mostly using them to research or bounce ideas around. Minority were using them to actually do any writing. And most people, again, I think it was somewhere in the region of 70%. I gave people a load of options of was it making it better or worse, a bit better, a bit worse, easier, not easier. The vast majority of people said using AI writing tools was making their job a bit easier and their work a bit better. And I was surprised because the predominant narrative on LinkedIn seems to be that writers are railing against AI tools mostly. And I wonder if that's partly because that's the predominant narrative, partly because, you know, making a loud noise about strong opinion is the thing that gets engagement, partly because you can feel like this is crap and I don't like it, but also I'm using it and I kind of reluctantly agree it makes it a bit better, which I think is what the survey was largely showing. But to go back to the point about like specificity of language, what is it we're actually talking about here when we talk about AI? It's thrown around. I think people don't really understand. Like a large language model like ChatGPT is a narrow task specific AI tool. So is the autocorrect on your iPhone. So is Google Maps. So is the face recognition tech that unlocks your phone. Those are all AI. So when we're talking about AI, I think we should be particular about which things we mean. Um, and I watched a great talk a couple of weeks ago by Benedict Evans, and he was quoting a data scientist whose name I think is Larry Tesler, saying AI is everything that doesn't work yet. And once it starts working, we just call it software. Like basically, if we don't quite get it and it doesn't quite fit and we don't really know what to do with it, it's AI. And then as soon as it's Google Maps and it works and we have it every day, it's old hat and we just think of it as a bit of software. And that his feeling was that that was probably going to be true of something like ChatGPT in the future. It's just going to stop feeling magical and start feeling like old hat. My personal views on AI are pretty complicated. Like I don't use it much. I'm one of those people who occasionally uses it to ask a really niche question on Google that I probably wouldn't be able to find otherwise. There's definitely a bunch of peer-reviewed evidence that suggests that if you rely, like heavily rely on something like ChatGPT to outsource critical thinking stuff, it will make you, for lack of a better word, dumber, like less capable of critical thinking. In the same way that if you rely on Google Maps, you are measurably less good at finding your own directions. From an ethical environmental standpoint, I think the current kind of AI sphere is a total shit show. It needs to be a lot more regulation, but regulation always lags behind technological innovation, right? And there's definitely a sense of a bit of a tulip mania about AI and funding for AI at the moment, companies falling over themselves to be AI forward, but AI forward as if that is an end in itself. I prefer to assess kind of each tool individually and go on a case by case basis, is this going to help me do the thing I'm trying to do better? So ChatGPT is good at answering a niche question that might be hard on Google, although Google now has AI overview that does broadly the same thing. As long as I interrogate the sources closely, because quite often it will hallucinate and totally make up sources that don't exist. Google Maps is better at finding my way home in a place I don't know than I would be on my own. So that is useful. So just like any other tool, which thing am I looking at in front of me and does it help me do the job better and not just quicker, which is what most, certainly AI writing tools seem to do right now, is they help you do more mediocre stuff faster. Which depending on what metrics you're trying to optimize for, that might be your thing. That's not the thing that I'm trying to do.
I mean, this podcast is again has been like learning curve in the sense of when it comes to writing the blurbs for episodes, I treat them as distinct pieces of writing um, that I intentionally think about and craft before I publish an episode. However, I'm really bad, ironically for a commerce person, kind of bad at like marketing techniques like SEO words and stuff. So on the platform I use, there is an AI tool that occasionally I'll use to, can you rewrite this to optimize search engine keywords? It's long disappeared from the internet, but there was a military writer called Adam Elkis, and he wrote a great blog post about people find it easier to argue about tools than they do the ends for which they're being used. So,
Mm.
like at the time, this was like 2012. Um, People found it easier to argue about drones. Should we use them? Should we not use them? Yeah, yeah. Than having a debate about whether Western troops should be in Afghanistan and what the correct strategy was for either defeating the Taliban and Al Qaeda, whether counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. All that was too hard. So they would just argue about the tool, even though drones pose no new ethical considerations that airplanes or missiles do. Um, so as you kind of touched on, it's similar with AI. It's a tool, and it's how you use it that's the key thing.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I completely agree. And that, one of those is a big, difficult, convoluted, multifaceted problem, and one of them is a more narrow thing, and we find it easier to latch onto the more narrow thing.
How is shaping the narrative and the words for a uh, green technology company?
Yeah. I mean, for the one that I work for, it's pretty straightforward because we save you a buttload of money. And I think that is the thing that if you're in the world of like, clean energy comms, net zero is bad framing, I think. Like, first of all, people don't know what net means, like in terms of finances, net as versus gross versus whatever else. And zero is not aspirational. It's an absence. It's not bad. It's not good. It's just nothing. Is nothing motivational in any way? Probably not. We're going nowhere. That's not something to rally behind. So the case for positive change is what you need to do. And part of the like I always thought when I left Monzo that I would go energy, clean energy, like climate, something like that felt like the thing I wanted to go into to do some good, and also because it's kind of it's the only game in town. If we don't get that right, all of the other games are kind of irrelevant or less relevant. But like the big picture climate policy stuff just felt I didn't really know where to begin. Whereas Sunsave, if you get, I'm not going to do this full sales pitch for Sunsave, but basically you can get a solar panel and battery system with us. It costs you nothing up front. You pay for it over time. You save money immediately. And over the lifetime of that system, it can save you quite literally tens and tens and tens of thousands of pounds. All you have to do is get solar panels and battery. You're less dependent on the grid. You save money immediately. You have more control over what you're doing. You are greener as a result. And I think the more that like private industries can generate good news stories about clean energy that way, the easier the big picture policy stuff will be. But I do definitely think that the language around net zero needs to be more aspirational and positive, because the green energy transition should save people an absolute ton of money eventually. And for some people, if you're fortunate enough to be able to get solar panels on your roof, for example, it can be saving you loads of money right now.
I mean, my brother has his own solar panel installation company.
Oh no, I'm going to put him out of business. I'm sorry.
um, but like what you said about saving money over the long term, I think a problem he's had with framing is like kind of similar to net zero. It's proving a negative. It's sort of like uh, you have no conception of those tens and thousands in the future.
Yeah.
So how do
Well,
you?
yeah, I'm assuming that if he's doing, because well, I know that he doesn't do it this way because we're the only people that have the licensing to be able to do £0 up front because we do it on finance. So in his case, and in most solar installation companies' cases, you have to pay somewhere in the region of 10 grand up front. And then somewhere in the future, you will see a return. That's a hard story to sell. With us, you pay nothing up front, your bill goes down instantly, you're already saving money in the first month. And that's an easier story to sell. And that's why I think we're going to be more successful and why it's an easier message to send. But yeah, people thinking long term versus short term, like there's behavioral heuristics where we overvalue money now versus money in the future. That's definitely a cognitive bias that we have, and that's a difficult problem to solve. And again, that's why net zero is hard, because we're thinking about the beautiful future for our kids and whoever else. Yeah, but right now, my bill costs loads, and I don't have enough to fill the car to get to work. And more green energy solutions need to be relevant to now, and that's to do with legislation and financing and structuring of what stuff is on offer. And I think what we're doing at Sunsave is a good example of it.
Harry, thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron.